What do you think it is that's driving people not to want to share? And, you get into it a little bit there. There's sort of a negative social stigma to gun ownership in certain communities. Do you think that's the full explanation, or do you see potentially more to it than that?
Well, the researchers themselves speculated. They said that a lot of people may not trust that the survey results will not be shared with government. That means that if they say, yes, I own a gun, and the government decides that it's going to change policy and criminalize the ownership of a firearm, they then may be targeted. So lack of trust in a stranger on the phone or a stranger at the door is going to be part of it. That's going to be hard to address. Another part, of course, is that, yes, you've got a lot of the new gun owners are in communities that traditionally considered to be restrictive to guns, certainly, and culturally unfriendly to guns, I would say, in many, many cases. So they may not want that shared. But also, universities now are perceived, and academic researchers, as almost all being on the political left and therefore presumptively unfriendly to gun ownership. So if someone calls you on the phone and says, I'm from the University of whatever, I'd like to ask you about gun ownership. Most people, I think, at this point are going to assume that the person on the phone has a preconceived notion about gun ownership, has set ideas about it, is unfriendly to the whole concept, and they're probably going to respond accordingly. This, of course, has big implications for the larger picture beyond firearms. As universities have become more politicized, as people have become less trustful in government, social trust now is at rock bottom levels across the board, not just in institutions, but between Americans with each other. People perceive hostility from other groups, from the government, and from institutions that they consider alien. It's going to be very hard to fix survey results based on traditional research methods. They're going to have to devise something that's entirely different in order to build trust before you then start asking about sensitive issues. And they still may not find an easy fix for this. I don't see how you do that in kind of a cheap way without actually entering the community, setting up shop, and becoming part of that community. But there are huge implications from these findings.
Yeah, I mean, the researchers themselves did point out a number of different motivations that they thought people could have, especially in these different groups that they identified. One of the, and some of them that you've gone over there, like they perhaps live in a more liberal area where gun ownership is frowned upon. They may distrust academic institutions like Rutgers, like an institution that I think a lot of the gun rights activists would probably distrust this institution that produced this study, to be completely frank. And so they thought that could be a motivation. And then, minority communities may have a distrust of authority figures for a totally different reason than gun rights activists do, if that makes sense. Like,
oh, absolutely, yes.
The same level of mistrust, but it comes from very different places. And they noted all of that to their credit in their write-up. It is something that I think is going to be difficult to overcome. And it does have it's interesting, how do you move forward as a writer, as somebody who analyzes these things, with this knowledge that there is, this was something we assumed perhaps, right, for a long time, but now there's a study that's quantifying it to some degree. And the amount that they put on it, right, it's almost half the people that said they don't own guns that fit the model, at least to a certain threshold, for people who do own guns. So, that's a huge discrepancy. That would put the number, would rocket it up from something like 33% into the 60% range. So, how do you, as an analyst, as a writer, move forward with this sort of information that perhaps all this information we're seeing is not as reliable as we might have thought it was?
I think I incorporated into a big problem overall in polling, but also in the social sciences. There's what's called a replication crisis in the social sciences, and has been now for about 20 years. What it comes down to is that psychology, sociology, anthropology, if you look at studies that are supposed to be evidence for any conclusion, and then you go out and you take the same study and you try to get results that resemble those results that were first achieved, you can't very often. In more than half of cases, studies can't be replicated. They produce results that are wildly at odds with the original study. I think what we're going to find is that a lot of the surveys of things about guns, but also anything else that might be politically or legally fraught, are simply untrustworthy. We're going to have a replication crisis that extends into more areas. So this isn't something that exists in isolation. What it means is that researching a population, especially a distrustful population, and the American population is distrustful and probably growing increasingly so, that researching this population is going to be very difficult. Political polling, notoriously inaccurate in recent years and growing more so, might be fixable in some ways, but I know that I hang up on political pollsters, and I think a lot of people do. So I write about it as a phenomenon, knowing that the data that I read in studies is often unreliable. I don't mention that in my writing as often as I should. I think there's an illusion of certainty sometimes when we read something that's written in academic language that has numbers with decimal points after it. These numbers aren't anywhere near as reliable as we often pretend. And I often then come across results on the same issue that are wildly at odds with the first research paper. And that really should clue us in that these studies aren't as reliable as we'd like them to be. This gun study, the idea that we don't have a handle on how many gun owners there are, is part of this larger issue. We have to address that there's a wide range of uncertainty, and that a lot of that is deliberate. A lot of people don't want to be tagged and identified. They don't trust the people asking them questions, and they're not going to make it easy on researchers, on pollsters, on surveyors until trust is re-earned, which it probably will not be in the near future. So other research methods will have to be developed, or just as likely, we'll have to live in a world of uncertainty.